One of the most important things to remember is that authorship comes with responsibilities. And because it comes with responsibilities, there are criteria that authors have to meet in order to qualify to be listed as an author on the paper. I'm showing you here the Taylor and Francis editorial policies on authorship criteria. And what we say, which is very similar to what most other publishers will say, is that you qualify for authorship if you have made a significant contribution to the work. What that contribution is, it can be anything because it depends on the nature of the research. So it can be the conception, it can be the execution, the analysis, etc. But any author listed has to have made a significant contribution to the work.
Diễn giả dữ liệu hoặc là tất cả những cái giai đoạn này, và họ cũng phải tham gia vào cái quá trình mà viết cái bài.
Usually the case that one or two of the co-authors take the responsibility to write the main paper, and that's fine. But anyone listed has to at least have critically reviewed the article, because they have to agree that yes, this is the right interpretation of the result. This is how we want to present it. So all of the co-authors are agreeing on what has been drafted. They also have to agree on the journal that the article will be submitted to. And this is because it's actually not allowed to submit to more than one journal at the same time. Now, if you have submitted to one journal and maybe you got a rejection from there, then you can go to another journal, but not at the same time. And sometimes what happens, because of a miscommunication between co-authors, one author might submit to one journal and the other author submits to another journal, and then they've actually committed misconduct without knowing. And so actually part of our criteria is being an author means also agreeing on the journal where the article will be submitted. Being an author also means being involved in the process. So as the article might change. So from submission, there might be changes requested from the editor. If it goes through peer review, usually there is therefore a requirement to revise the article. So any listed co-author has to be involved in that process as well. And this is all because of the final point. So the final point, number 5, is all listed authors agree to take responsibility and be accountable for the contents of the article. So they share this responsibility. So it's important to note that any listed author is a representative of that paper, and they're agreeing on around the integrity of the content of that paper. If the article is accepted, the publisher will give you a legal document. So this is an author publishing agreement. This is a legal document, and usually the corresponding author signs that on behalf of co-author. And that document includes warranties like, I agree, this is original, I agree, I have permission to publish this, etc., etc. And that's why it's important that all listed co-authors are aware of every aspect of the article. Sometimes there are disputes, there are disagreements regarding authorship. So sometimes it happens that we've received a submission, and as it's going through peer review, someone else contacts us and says, I should have been an author on this paper, I have been left out, you need to do something. Or it could be after we've published the article, someone might come and say, I should have been an author, or there's some other kind of disagreement. Sometimes author number 3 on the list says, I should be author number 1. The main thing to remember is that the publisher cannot resolve authorship disputes. And this is because we don't know the full story. We can't know the full story. That is known by the institution. So if there is an authorship dispute, we will say to the authors, you have to come to an agreement between yourselves, involve your institution, and when you have all worked on this together, then come back to us and then we can proceed. So we as a publisher cannot resolve the dispute, but we will wait for consensus. So if the manuscript has not been published, we will actually just stop all the processes, and we will tell the author and whoever is complaining, we have stopped everything on this until you have reached an agreement. And then once a consensus is reached between all authors, including anyone being added, anyone being removed, then we can progress with that. And we ask for confirmation from all of the authors, anyone being added or removed. Everyone then has to confirm to us that they agree to the new authorship list. And then that's fine, we can proceed. So the main thing to remember is an authorship dispute has to be resolved between the authors and also the institution. One of the other areas that becomes a problem is gift authorship. So I was just talking about the responsibility that comes with authorship. In gift authorship, what happens is someone is added as an author as a gift. So sometimes it could be as a favor, it could be for some other reason, but the main thing is that person has not actually been involved with that work. So they're just being added for some other reason. And the reason that's a problem is because if there's someone who has been added as an author, they now have responsibility about an article that they haven't been involved with. And sometimes it happens without their knowledge. So we hear this often, we get contacted by someone saying, I never agreed to be an author on this paper. Why am I listed as an author? And then they want to be removed. And we find out that the authors thought, oh, we will make them happy if we add them, as they might be quite senior. We will add them, they will be happy. But actually, they weren't involved and they didn't even ask. So that's a very serious problem, and it's considered misconduct because you cannot give authorship as a gift to someone who hasn't been involved with the work. So what are the problems that can arise from gift authorship? It creates a culture of actually not being honest about who is a representative of the work. And that's why it is regarded as misconduct. And there's also the serious issue about accountability. Listed authors are accountable for the published work. But if someone has been gifted that authorship, how can they be accountable because they weren't involved in the work? And then there's awareness. Sometimes gift authorship, I just mentioned, occurs without the knowledge of whoever has been gifted the authorship. So that can create serious problems for them. The other issue that is a major problem nowadays is authorship for sale. So gift authorship is where someone is doing it as a favor or because they think someone will be happy. But authorship for sale is actually where people will buy the authorship spot on a paper. So this is conducted by dishonest people or organizations, for example, paper mills, and they create fake papers and they sell the authorship spots on this. And those papers also are problematic because they're fake. So they contain fake data or fake images, plagiarized text. And the problem with this is it can lead to the publication of fraudulent and unreliable work. Also, what happens is they often will submit the same paper to different journals with different author lists because they're selling the same paper to different people. And the researchers being listed as authors haven't been involved with the work. So often it doesn't even match their area of expertise. And of course, the main issue is there's very big reputational damage for authors and institutions because when it's discovered that this was a fraudulent paper, the article will get retracted, and that does bring reputational damage for authors and institutions. So it's a very big area of concern for us at the moment. The other type of authorship issue is ghost authorship. So ghost authorship is like the opposite of what we have just been talking about. Ghost authorship is when someone has actually contributed to the work, they have participated, but they have not been listed as an author. So that's why it's called ghost authorship. So it could be that a junior researcher has done a lot of the work, but when it came to writing the paper, they were not added as an author on the paper, but they actually contributed to the work significantly. Or sometimes it is that the author who is not listing themselves is doing that because they want to hide any conflicts of interest that they might have. So they're hiding their contribution. And so that's why ghost authorship is a problem as well. So this all comes down to who is responsible for the work, who has conducted the work, who is taking responsibility for the work when it's going through submission and also after publication. So issues arising from ghost authorship include the credit. You know, someone has done the work, they should get credit for that. So ghost authorship results in a lack of credit for those who have contributed. It conceals their involvement as well. So concealing their involvement, concealing the fact that they influence the research and interpretation of the data is also a problem, because it means they are also concealing any relevant competing interests that they might have. So sometimes it's necessary to change an authorship list. So it might be that during revision, the authors have added, brought in more contributors because they needed further help with the experiment. Or it could be someone says, actually, I haven't contributed to this, so I'm going to remove myself as an author. So changes to authorship list is common, it's nothing unusual, but we do have to be sure that it is ethical. So at Taylor and Francis, after the journal has accepted an article, if for any reason the co-authors need to change, there is a process that we have to follow. And there will be an authorship change request form that the authors are requested to fill out. And this is because the form will ask all of the relevant information so that we can be sure that the change requested is, first of all, ethical and meets the criteria, and that everyone is in agreement. So if there are any times where you need to change the authorship list, please check with the publisher what the process is. The other thing to bear in mind is acknowledgements. So if anyone has helped in some way with the work, but doesn't meet the criteria for authorship, then the ethical thing to do is acknowledge them. So normally an article will have a section on acknowledgements, and you can thank people. You can name them and say, we thank them for helpful discussion and so on and so forth. Now, that is good. It's always ethical to acknowledge someone who has helped. But the thing to remember is if you are adding someone's name into the acknowledgements, you are identifying them. And so you have to let them know that you're acknowledging them in here. So you have to take the step to notify them, obtain permission from anyone specifically named in the acknowledgement section. Why? Sometimes they don't want to be named. Sometimes they have for personal reasons. They may say, actually, the times we have seen this is when there has been some political issues, and they say, actually, I might get into trouble if it is publicly known that I have been corresponding with you, because there might be a political problem between the countries or that kind of thing. It's rare. It is rare, but the more common reason why this is important is because sometimes the author, the person who is being acknowledged, actually thinks they should have been an author. So there's this element of fairness. So sometimes they say, actually, I helped you a lot. I think I meet the criteria for authorship. And then there is a dispute. So it's better to get that clear first before submitting. So always, if you're naming someone in the acknowledgement section, notify them, let them know you're acknowledging them so they are aware and they can agree to that or resolve, any questions around authorship. So the main thing is about the transparency about that. And so we ask, in our submission system, we ask authors to confirm that anyone that has been named has been notified and has given permission. So the summary of this part is that there are several criteria to meet for authorship, and individuals qualify for authorship if they significantly contributed to the editing, design, analysis, execution, etc. And they must also agree on the journal to submit to and approve any major revisions. As publishers, we cannot resolve authorship disputes. We have to wait for there to be a consensus. So we will halt all processes on our side until the authorship dispute has been resolved. And in an authorship dispute, it's the institutions who play a key role in resolving that. And the other thing to remember is to avoid any kind of accidental authorship misconduct, like gift and ghost authorship. Gift authorship can create, a kind of culture that actually isn't an ethical one, and it misrepresents who did the research. So just being aware of why gift authorship and ghost authorship is a problem will allow you to avoid this as a problem later on. Many times we know it happens because of a lack of full understanding about how serious authorship is. So just keeping that in mind will help you avoid problems going forward. So I will pause briefly at this point in case there are any questions. So I think there are no questions, so we will continue. There will be more pauses along the way to ask. So now we've talked about authorship. The next thing I'm going to touch briefly on is study design and research ethics. And the reason why I'm going to touch on that is because as publishers of many different types of research, we ask for key declarations around things like ethical approval, informed consent, permission for reuse. These things can change according to what the study design is. So I'm just giving you here an example. It's not a full list of all the different types of study designs, but just as an example, if the study includes observational sort of research data, we would be aware that maybe if it's been done in a public place, informed consent from those being observed might not always be necessary, but this varies from country to country. So we as the publisher have to be very mindful of what is the setting of the research, what would be the rule in that setting. But if it's not in a public place, then they would always need informed consent and ethical approval. All of these examples I'm showing here, we would always expect to see ethical approval has been obtained from an appropriate board or committee. There are things like using data sets. So let's say the researcher has published work and they've used data set from another party. What we look for is, did they have permission to use the data set? Did they get permission? If the data set includes information about human participants, did they anonymize that before sharing it? And there are other kinds of cultural sensitivities that we need to be very mindful of. So that's why sometimes after submitting an article, we ask further questions to the author. That where did you get approval from? Did you get informed consent? Did you get the required permission? Because all of that means that if you have that in place, then we can proceed with the paper. So it's important to bear in mind how your study design affects the requirements to make declarations on ethics. One of the key things to think about is consent. So if the research involves human participants, we would always expect to see informed consent was obtained. And this is for, many different types of studies. If the participants are young in age, so if they are, for example, not classed as adults, then we would expect to see the consent has been obtained from their parent or guardian. And why is this? Well, this is because we also want to make sure that what we are publishing has been ethically conducted. So if there are human participants, it should always be voluntary, that they've agreed to be part of this study. It's voluntary for them. So we expect to see the statement in the article that ethical or institutional approval was obtained and that consent was obtained. For some types of studies, in some settings, consent or ethical approval might not be required. If that is the case, we then ask the authors to explain that. Why? Under what criteria was this waived? So just being mindful of what is expected in terms of in terms of the statements required in your research article will prevent a lot of problems for you later on. So the key elements of informed consent is transparency. So disclose all relevant information to the participants. So they need to be aware of any risks and how the research results are likely to be disseminated. Also, the person giving consent has to be competent to give consent. So they need to be able to fully understand what you're asking them to consent to, because it's voluntary. So they need to be able to make that decision. And the other key area is freedom, the fact that they know that just because they are consenting today doesn't mean they can't revoke that consent later on. It's voluntary. They can leave the study at any time. And this type of thing is very important, especially if it's a clinical trial. And so that's why sometimes we might go back to the author and say, could you give us more information how consent was obtained? The other thing to bear in mind is if the article contains information that can identify someone, then you require consent to publish. So that's different from what we just talked about, consent to participate. Consent to publish is where if the article contains really detailed information about someone, or their photos, their scans, their video, audio recordings, private quotes, they can be identified, then authors need to contact them to get consent to publish that. If they don't have consent to publish that, then the authors have to try and anonymize it further. Or if that's not possible, then we can't publish it, because we as publishers cannot publish content that breaches someone's right to privacy. And so if that happens, then we have to take steps to remove that. So just to put this in context, I'm going to show you a case here. So this is a real case. So here, the issue was that the researcher didn't have consent to publish. So in this case, the research included interviews with 4 carriers of a rare disease, and all of them were based in the same small region and part of the same family. The exact location is a key part of the study, so that can't be removed, as the disease arises from a unique feature of the local environment, so they have to name the location. The family is also important to the study, because they are the ones who are carrying this uncommon gene. So let's say this is your research and you now wish to publish your work, and you feel that naming the location of the study and the family is essential to the article. However, you have not sought consent to publish from the people you interviewed, and you cannot properly anonymize the findings because there are very specific details here, like the location and the family, which is required for the article. So let's say that was your paper. What should you do? if anyone wants to, you know, say in the chat, I can pause here for about, you know, a few seconds. If anyone wants to say, I will show you the answer, but if someone wants to say something. I think, yeah, I'm going to reveal what you should do. So let's just bear in mind, this article can identify the people who are interviewed because they have to name the location and the family, so they can be identified. So if this is your article, what should you do? Really, it is obtain consent to publish from all the interviewees. So there were 4 interviewees, and it's important to get consent from them. And what we as a publisher would require is a statement within the article to confirm that consent to publish was obtained from all of the interviewees. So why is this necessary? Well, it's because all of the interviews can potentially be identified from the details provided in the article. There's only 4 of them. It's about a very rare condition, and the location is named, the family, you know, the fact they are a family is also said. So they would definitely be able to be identified. So getting consent would be actually required here, because not getting consent to publish, if we then publish that article, we would be breaching their right to privacy. And they would have legal grounds to, you know, sue the author, sue the publisher, because there is a breach of their privacy. So it's important to understand in which situation consent to publish should be obtained. Now, if this was a large study, if you had like 50 people that were interviewed, and it was not on something rare, it might have been, so it wasn't on a rare disease. What happens there, because the sample size is big, and because you're not talking about something specific to a family, it's not as likely that they can be identified. So in those situations, we wouldn't expect to see consent to publish. So the key to bear in mind is if you have a small sample, 1 or 2, 3 people that you're discussing, that's when you need to think about consent to publish. But if it's a large sample size, it becomes less likely that they can be identified. And so you don't need to do that. So it's just thinking, why would we need to do that? So at Taylor & Francis, we provide a consent to publish form. Many publishers will provide this, but many institutions might also have this as well. The key is the top part will give information about the submission, and then the information from the participant. This is where they sign this. And then the author's signature. Now, we do not ask to see these forms routinely because it is a sensitive document. It will contain people's names and signatures. But if there is a concern, if the editor is worried, or if we just do want to make an additional check, we would ask the author to send a copy of the form. And when we no longer need it, then we would destroy it because we don't want to keep a copy of that. So it's very important for authors to keep copies of these because the editor, the publisher may actually ask to see it. So key things to remember from this part of the session is that study designs are different, and because they are different, they have specific ethical requirements. So based on your research, you need to consider different ethics issues, and behaving in line with the guidelines and expectations in your field and declaring that within your article will prevent a lot of problems for you later on. And consent should always be obtained. Just take that part seriously, that if anyone is participating in the research, they have to have given voluntary informed consent. And obtaining consent to publish if they can be identified, but only if they can be identified, is required from whoever can be potentially identified. And we would expect to see statements to confirm these included in the article. So then we move to competing interests. So competing interests sometimes are also referred to as conflict of interest. And what this is if the author or any of the authors have any other kind of incentive or involvement which would benefit, from the work, they have to declare that as a competing interest. So at Taylor and Francis, we divide it by financial competing interest. For example, collaborations with advocacy groups, getting grants from an entity that would benefit from the research, having stocks or shares, in something related to the work. These are all kind of financial competing interests. And then we also have non-financial competing interests. So, for example, receiving gifts. So if it's that the research is on a particular device and that device was gifted by the company that gave it to you, then having to declare that this was gifted to us is important. That transparency is important. And if there's any involvement in legal action related to the work or holding other kinds of positions that can be perceived as a competing interest. We always advise authors that if there are any financial or non-financial competing interests, it is much better to declare it. Because if someone can see it as a competing interest, and you haven't declared it, then it leads to accusations of, oh, you're hiding something, and actually you're not. So just being very clear, what may my competing interests be? Check the publisher policy. We've listed examples here as financial, as non-financial. If it fits in with any of that, it's always better to declare it. So we'll talk about another hypothetical case. So this is about competing interests. So here, your research article includes results that will benefit company A. You also own shares of company A. Should you disclose this to the journal as a competing interest? Yes or no? If anyone wants to say or type it. So I will say yes, it should be declared. Because if the research article is reporting results that actually will be beneficial, a good thing for company A, and you also own shares of company A, actually, as the author of the research, that whether findings will benefit the company you own shares in will also benefit from the findings. So this is a competing interest. So it's important to be transparent about competing interests, and therefore this should be disclosed to the journal. If in doubt, sometimes authors aren't sure. If in doubt, check with the editor. So now we move to duplicate submissions and publications. So I said towards the beginning that you can't submit the same article to more than one journal at the same time. What you will find when you submit to a journal, one of the first questions you are asked is about confirming originality. Now, why do we insist this? So publishers, we have to ask this question because otherwise we wouldn't have the required rights to handle the article. So by submitting just to one journal, you are giving permission to that journal to share your article, send it to peer reviewers, send it to other members of staff who need to do something in this. So I think that often it's not understood why it's not possible to submit to more than one journal at the same time. That's why we ask to declare it. So it's a very important thing to remember. If the journal you have submitted to first has rejected it, then you can take that article to another journal. If the journal you submitted to first, maybe you've changed your mind. Maybe you think they're taking too long. So you have a right to withdraw that article. So you can contact the journal and say, actually, sorry, we've changed our mind. We are withdrawing our article from the journal. And then that journal has to then remove it from the system. So you have that option. So the important thing is if you have submitted to one journal, don't submit to another journal. If you want to withdraw, then withdraw and then submit to wherever you want to go to. As I said, authors must declare at submission that the manuscript has not been submitted elsewhere. And if the article goes on to become accepted, there is a legally binding publishing agreement that you will receive from the publisher. And that is giving the publisher the rights to publish that article and disseminate the article. So you can't give the same right to two different journals, because this is not, it's not actually allowed. So that is another area where there would be misconduct. If it has been submitted and published in two different journals, that is serious misconduct. There are times when it is possible to submit a duplicate submission, but what kind of situations can that be? So one is actually translations. So if, for example, you have an article that you've published in another language, and now you want to publish it in a different language in a different journal, then you might want to translate that. So the key thing is to remember is being transparent with the journal you want to submit to. Not all journals will consider translations. Many will, but not all will. So the first thing is to think about the journal you want to submit your translated article to, contact the editor, ask the editor that, would you consider a translated article? And the other thing to remember is if it is being translated from an original version, authors need to check with that original publisher in case there are any restrictions or permission requirements. So just checking with whoever published it first, would there be any problem if they were to translate that into, let's say, into English? And if they have translated the article, then it's important to be clear that this is a translation. So let's say your original article is in Vietnamese and you've translated it into English and you are now submitting it to an English language journal. It's important to be clear in the article, this is a translation of this original article. So you should cite the original article because it's important to be clear to readers and editors when that original article was published, especially if it's research. So best practice is state it's a translation in the abstract, maybe the main text, and cite the original article. Check with the editor if they will consider translations. Like I said, many will, but it's a good practice to check first and always be clear in the article. This is a translation of the original version and cite the original version. The other thing that is becoming more and more common is having a preprint. So you could have an early version of the full article that is hosted in an institutional repository or a preprint server like bioRxiv or arXiv, that kind of thing. In most cases, this is fine. We don't consider this a duplicate submission, but again, it's important to be clear with the journal and check journal policies on that. The other area is conference communications. We know researchers will go to conferences, they will communicate their early data, communicate their work. That's absolutely normal. As long as it's not the full version of your article, if it's not everything that you're showing that was published in a similar way in a conference proceeding is usually okay. So if it's things like parts of data or short abstracts presented at conferences, we don't consider that a problem at all. So just being clear about what is or is not okay. If it's the full version that appears somewhere else, then being transparent about that to the editorial office will again save you a lot of problems later on. So the thing to remember is competing interests should always be declared openly if you have competing interests. And behaving transparently will always help you. So not submitting to more than one journal at the same time, being accountable for the article, and being ready to answer questions, from the editorial office will, again, it will help you a lot to get into the practice of that. Never be afraid to approach the editor or the journal. When you have submitted, if you have questions, you have every right to ask questions to the journal and the journal editor. So I will pause again for any questions.
Sabine, you have questions in both the Q&A and the chat.
Okay. Okay, so I'm looking at the first question in the Q&A. So I'm just confused a bit. I was taught that all the information of the interview, such as their real name, address, personal photos, etc., have to be hidden to keep them safe. So I always give them some nicknames. So so the same person who said, in this case, how should I do? Because I made a promise with the Vietnamese residents I interviewed about that. Promise is promise. So yes, so anyone you are interviewing, if you can keep them anonymous, always keep them anonymous. That is always the default position. The example I showed was that it was a very small sample size. There were only 4 people that were being interviewed. And because there were only 4 people and it was not possible to anonymize the location and the family relationship, because the entire point of that research was about this rare gene. It was a genetic disorder that ran in this family. Because even though the article would not publish their names or their faces, because there's only 4 of them, they're all in the same family, and they all live in the same place, it would not be possible to actually anonymize them. And that's why in that case, consent to publish was needed. But generally, for any of the standard kind of interview-based research that happens, usually is amongst a much larger number of people. And it won't be on something as so specific to this family or this region. So if it's possible to keep it anonymous and you feel that you've taken out, that you haven't included their real name, address, there's no personal photos, that is absolutely the right thing to do. And if it's not possible to identify them, then you don't need to get consent to publish. So that is what you're meant to do. The example I showed is sometimes it's not possible to keep them anonymous, and you have to be aware of that. That just because you haven't included their real name, address, personal photos, doesn't mean they absolutely cannot be identified. Sometimes they can. And so if they can, then you need to think about consent to publish. So that was what that example was about. And then I'll go to the chat. So I'll read the ones I see. If I've missed any, then let me know. So how to prove an author is a ghost gift authorship. Number 1, yes, that's difficult. Number 2, can a journal rely solely on the author's honesty? Number 3, what do the journal need to prevent ghost gift authorship? Yeah, these are very good and challenging questions. So I'll start with number 1. Proving an author, has gift authorship, ghost authorship. It's the only time we know for sure is actually when we hear from someone. So sometimes we get contacted by a person saying, I never agreed to be an author on this paper. I want to be removed. And then we check with the co-authors and they say, oh, yeah, we did this because of XYZ reason. That's usually how we know someone has been gifted authorship. And that requires us to then remove that person. Ghost authorship. Now, if ghost authorship was done because they forgot to add someone, so if it was that they didn't give credit to someone, again, that's usually how we would find out. They would contact us and say, I should have been an author on that paper. I did that work. And then we can address it that way. Sometimes, though, if it's because they want to deliberately hide their involvement, again, the main way we know is that we would hear from a whistleblower. We would hear from someone else saying, I know this person was involved. So often the information is actually, it comes to us from either the authors or from someone else. Number two, can a journal rely solely on the author's honesty? Well, we want to, we want to have that relationship with authors, but because some types of misconduct happen because of a lack of awareness about standard rather than a deliberate attempt, we therefore ask very specific questions. When you are submitting your article, we ask very specific questions that, did you get permission to reuse this article? Did you get consent from participants? Because we want to ask specific questions so you can think about if anything has gone wrong. We would always start with trusting the author, but where we have cases where we know the article is fraudulent, so it contains fraudulent data or fraudulent authorship list, then we have to take steps to investigate that. And sometimes it does happen that unfortunately the author in that case could not be trusted. So I wouldn't say we can rely solely just because we know there are so many problems, but we always try to have that relationship with the authors. Number three, what do the journal need to do to prevent ghost thief authorship? So one of the things that we do and many other publishers do is when the article is submitted, then the co-author email addresses also have to be there, and they will be alerted that there is a paper that has been submitted in your name. The other things we do is actually activities like this, outreach, actually talking to researchers, making them aware about authorship standards and types of misconduct in order to spread awareness about the problems and being clearer in our editorial policies. But there's a lot in this area to do. So then I have a question here. I'm only reading the ones in English, forgive me. So may I ask a question? Can the author update the new information and or new data to submit again? Yes, absolutely. So if during the submission process, the author wants to update the article, that can be done in the revision stage. But if it's that the article has been, let's say the article has been rejected, then that's back to the author. So the author can, by all means, update it with new data. They can either go to the original journal if that original journal asks them to resubmit, or they can go somewhere else. Once the article has been, let's say the article has been rejected, then it's back to the author with all the same, same level of control that you have before you submitted. So you can always update that and resubmit to the same journal or a different journal. That's not generally a problem. There's two questions, but I don't have the skills to understand them. So if either someone could read them or we can come back to that later.
Hi, Dr. Sabina. Someone asked you that if they publish one paper or in Vietnamese.
Oh, you're on mute, Dr. Nayak.
Sorry, Dr. Sabina. Someone asked you that whether once they publish the paper on Vietnamese journal and then they add more content on that and then they translate it and they want to publish that copy version on the English journal. Is that okay?
So it depends on the level of new information that is being added. If it's a small amount of new information, then I would still be very transparent to the editor that I've published an earlier version in Vietnamese over here. I've added this much new data. You know, is that, you know, would it count as a new article or not? If they're adding a lot more new data, so if it's a fairly big follow-up to the original work, then I don't think you would need to treat that like a formal translation, because it would be significantly different to the early version published in Vietnamese. So it's just bearing in mind how much new information are you adding here? Is it a small amount, in which case treat it like a translation and follow the translation process? Or is it a large amount, in which case I would just cite the earlier work was done in this other journal, but you don't have to treat it like a formal translation if it is sufficiently different from the first one.
Another question from the audience. Can you hear me, Sabina?
Yes. Oh,
so yeah. So the question is, how specific, like the information about the information provider, like you need to be, for example, with the research carry out like in-depth interview method or with the group discussion, can we record it as like name and then location, commune, province, like the address? Is that, you know, like that specific, or like how specific would we need to provide in the paper?
Yes, that's a good question. So what we would say that there's a balance between reporting the required details about the methodology and the result, balancing that with anonymity. So if the work includes detailed information about people, then we would always advise, so we classify direct identifier and indirect identifier. So a direct identifier is like someone's age, their name, you know, things like that. An indirect identifier can be the general area they might be from. So we would always advise is that with the specific detailed information about the people, to ensure anonymity, only include what is absolutely necessary for understanding that article. So if it's that the specific age is necessary, then keep the specific age. If the specific age is not necessary, then we would say put it as an age range, like this many were between age 35 to 60, because then you start removing. If it's not necessary to say the gender, then don't say the gender. But if it is necessary to say the gender, then state that, but make sure there's not too many other direct information about it. So de-identifying is very, very important when it comes to potentially identifying people. If you are also publishing direct quotes from people, if the quotes are so specific to them and their experience or their family or something like that, again, that becomes like you can potentially identify. So the main thing to think about is if any of the specific information I'm giving about the people is not needed, then don't add it. And you can say that to the editor at submission, that this has been de-identified, but if the editor wants to see confidentially the full information, then they can see that. So we would always say only put in identifying information that is absolutely necessary. If you end up putting so much information that someone can be identified, then you start looking at needing consent to publish. So it is tricky, and I know it's tricky, because on one hand we say report everything, give all the details, share your data, but on the other hand we also have to be careful about breaching privacy. So number one is always protection of the participants. So if it's not possible to give all the detail without compromising the privacy of the participants, then that would always be priority number one. And we should always strive to make that, anonymized as far as possible. So there's another question here. An article has been published in Vietnamese. Oh no, I think we answered that one, didn't we? Oh yeah, and then this one so I think this was the one we just talked about, that can I ask how public and specific is information about the information provider, professor? For example, with the research conducted by in-depth interview and a group discussion, we record.
Yeah, so I think that's the same question.
The one we just, yeah. And so this is a a good example of is it necessary to say 42 years old worker? Is that important here or not? Maybe the region is more important. So then could you give an age range rather than being really specific? So it's those kinds of things to think about. But this is a very tricky issue, and more journals are asking for data sharing. And so you have to think about this as well with data sharing. So at Taylor & Francis, we are working on providing some more detailed guidance on anonymization. That's not published yet, but it is something we are working on to offer for free. Yeah, okay, I think that's all the questions. If not, let me know. But otherwise, shall we move to the next section? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you for all those questions, and do keep them coming. Okay, so now we're going to move to plagiarism and text recycling, everyone's favorite topic. So plagiarism is, there are many types of plagiarism. So there are plagiarism of ideas, processes, results, data, but also text plagiarism, and that is probably the one you're the most familiar with. Plagiarism is a really serious issue, and we see it all the time. And again, there's sometimes due to a lack of awareness about what is or is not okay regarding plagiarism, or it could be because it is deliberate. But the main thing is that plagiarism is the appropriation of another person's or group's ideas, processes, results, data, figures, or words without giving appropriate credit. But when I say without giving appropriate credit, it doesn't mean that it's also okay to just copy paste lots of text from somewhere and cite it. That's also not okay. So when we get any kind of allegations of plagiarism, we are always, we always have to investigate this. For text plagiarism, we use software. I know many different institutions will have this as well. We use Authenticate, but that would generally be one of the first things we would check if there is text plagiarism, and then we would end up having to have a discussion with the author. Plagiarism is grounds for retraction because it is a very serious issue. The other thing, more complex, is self-plagiarism. So this is where you haven't taken someone else's work, text, it's actually reusing your own. And again, we know researchers will be building on their own work. That's expected, that's common. But self-plagiarism is a problem when it's excessively repeating use of own work without there being a good reason. So, for example, we expect to see methodology. So the methods might be very, very similar, and that's fine. We don't worry about overlap there. But if they're reusing also a lot of their previous published data, previous published work, then what is actually new in this article? So this is where the problem is around excessively repeating use of own work to the point that it can distort the scholarly record. And so this is about not having enough novelty in the paper. So again, any alleged text recycling will be investigated. And again, if it's seen that there's so much self-plagiarism, it's actually like a duplicate publication, then we would retract the article. The other thing we look at is image or data integrity. So when it comes to image and data integrity, this can involve the maintenance of and the assurance of the image or data accuracy and consistency. And this is from all stages, from creation to publication and sharing, which is why it's becoming more and more common that journals will ask for the original data files or original image files. And it's important to be aware of that because it's becoming more expected that some journal may have a mandatory policy requiring that. Some may just ask for it when because they feel it's required, and that request can come at submission, it can come during review, it can come even after publication. So it's important to be aware that we are taking image and data integrity more and more seriously. When it comes to image falsification, this is mainly a problem in the sort of the life sciences fields. This can often be identified without software tools. So we would be able to manually identify image falsification. But for other types of things, we would often need to get independent experts to actually review the data integrity concerns. And that's why we would ask for further information from authors. So it's just for you to be aware of that for your research files, your original research files, just always keep a copy of it, don't lose it. Because when there is a problem and it has been lost, then it becomes much more difficult to verify the work. I'm showing here an example of what we say in our editorial policies. This is mainly geared towards the kind of bench science type data. But the main thing I wanted to show is that we say in our policies as well that authors should be prepared to share the original images. And if there are any images where there are modifications being made, it should never happen to alter the meaning of it. Any alterations have to be very clear. So again, this is more relevant for the kind of the science and technology type data. Key thing to take away from this session is that plagiarism is always unethical practice. Now, we sometimes hear from authors that, 30% is okay or 10% is okay. The thing I want to emphasize, it's not about the percentage. The problem with plagiarism is where the plagiarism is present. If we find there's overlap in the methods, it might be a common method, then we're not worried about if it's 10% or 30% because it's about where it is. But if the overlap is appearing in key areas of the article, which really should be novel, so this really like the results and the discussions, then again, it doesn't matter if it's 10% or 30%. The problem is where the plagiarism is and where it came from. So just being aware of that it's not, yes, the percentage is a guide, but when we are investigating plagiarism cases, we're not going, oh, only if it's 10% or 30%. We are always looking at where is the overlap, why is this a problem, is it a problem, and can it be fixed? So that's the main thing to keep in mind. Same goes for text recycling or self-plagiarism. We would be looking for the level of novelty. So this is similar to the question we had earlier on about if you had an article in Vietnamese and then you added some new information, translated that. This is sort of along those lines of if you are adding enough substantial new data, then it's not sort of salami slicing, what we would call. But if it's almost exactly the same, then it is considered to be text recycling. And for the case of a translation, that is different. When it comes to experimental images, any kind of image that is the basis of your research, your data, they should not be edited to modify the meaning. If they are changed at all, they should always be explained, and usually the original files would therefore need to be shared. Then we come to another area that causes a lot of problems, mainly because of sometimes not being familiar with the restrictions around reusing material, published material that is not your own. So third-party material includes, but is not limited to, any proprietary text or an illustration, a table, or other material. There are many types of content out there. The main thing to remember is if it has been published somewhere else and it's published by a third party, you have to think carefully before reusing any of those materials in your work. So cases where you likely have to contact the rights holder, so this is the entity that owns the right to that work, before reusing it in your article, are some examples here. This is not a full list. There are many other examples I'm not showing here, but these are the common ones that we might see. It all comes down to ownership, that as an author, if you are reusing content that has been published somewhere else, do you have the required permissions to reuse that? If not, then again, there's a serious breach of reuse there. So just keeping in mind that there are many types of materials that require permission. If it's not original, if it's not your own, think about, check. Normally there will be a kind of terms of use statement. If the images are available in an open format, so this is where the license for reuse is open, it will say that. If it's not, it will also say that. So always check to see whatever you're wanting to reuse, is it possible to reuse it without getting further permission, or actually do you have to get further permission, and if so, from who? So typically the information will be available in the, within the content of whatever you are trying to reuse. Limited reproduction is typically accepted. It's practice that reproduction of short extracts of text or some other types of material may be permitted for criticism and review. This is mainly common within the humanities and social sciences. However, if you're unsure, it's always best to check. So I'd always check with the editor or the publisher if you're unsure. So I'll pause again for questions if there are any. So there's a question here. After reading a book, I summarize the main points. then I quoted them in my article. How should I note the page number or something like that with the content is a summary. So that's sort of almost like a book review, or where you're quoting the book, and in that kind of case, unless you're taking original poetry or something or reproducing that, if it's that you are summarizing, this book has discussed XYZ and you've quoted that, as long as you've cited it, then that should be fine. And yes, noting the exact place that it is. So if it was, for example, in chapter 2, naming the edition as well. So the edition of the book, the volume of the book, the chapter, and yes, page number as well. Anything to be specific will allow you to cite that appropriately. Most publishers will also give guidance on how to reference these kinds of things as well. So if you're unsure, you can check the publisher website. But in general, that would be the thing. I would do the title of the book, the chapter, the edition, the volume number, the page number, just so that people can easily find it in the version of the book that you have taken it from. Because obviously books can be republished again, so be specific about the version, and that should be fine. So I'll check. Yeah, I think that's the only question there. So I will move to the next section. Yeah, okay, if I've missed any questions, then let me know. Okay, so now we're going to move into the part about what do we do as publishers? If there's a problem with something we have published, what is left within our remit? Okay, I've just got another question I saw come up. So I'll answer this question first before moving here. For figures or tables which we draw synthetic from various documents, how do we write sources? So if they're your original figures or tables, so you've been inspired by maybe you've seen figures or tables somewhere else, but you've recreated it in your own way from various documents. That's your original figure. So if you're not reproducing it exactly, if it doesn't look exactly the same, you have made it new, you have added new elements, you have essentially created a new figure. That's your new figure. So you don't have to then cite all of the sources that, especially if there are many different sources. The time it becomes important is if you have taken a figure from somewhere and you've done a minor adaptation. So you might have changed the color, or you might have changed an arrow somewhere, a minor adaptation. Then you would not only have to cite the sources, you would have to check if you need permission for reuse as an adaptation. But if what you're describing here sounds like quite a big change, because you're talking about lots of different documents and sources, if that is new, then it's your own original figure. Then you don't have to say it was inspired from every single one of these parts. So it really always depends on the level of change. Okay, I don't see any other new questions. So I'll go to the next section now. So yes, now, just 1 second, some water. Now we'll go on to what we as publishers have to do. If we have published work that now needs to be, there needs to be some action on it. What do we do? The key thing for us to bear in mind is that publishers have a responsibility towards permanency of content. What that means is once we have published something, we can't just silently make it disappear if there's a problem. So we can't say, oh, this article was plagiarized, let's just take it down. And that's because there's a record of it. So we can't just make it disappear. We have a responsibility to that. We are accountable for that. So what that means is that if there is some change that needs to happen to an article that has been published, it has to be done transparently, and it has to be done according to certain criteria. So this goes back to what I said right at the beginning about what is publishing ethics, who guides this. I mentioned it's a consensus-based system. And because it's a consensus-based system, most publishers will follow the kind of guidance I'm about to show you. And that will be our option to correct an article, retract an article, issue an expression of concern, or remove an article. So I'll show you what that means. The key thing to remember, though, is the record of the original article does not disappear, because we have to be open about it, and we have to give a reason for the change. So this is not about blaming anyone. It's just about everyone being clear about what change is made and why. So first, we'll talk about a correction notice now, and I will show you an example in the next slide. So a correction notice is when there has been some minor error in the article that needs to be corrected. So this is where there is no serious ethical issue. It can be something was mislabeled. It can be something that just requires correction because it could be misleading. But the idea is that there are no serious ethical issues. There's no plagiarism or things like that. The correction notice can be used to correct minor errors which do not impact the conclusions. Now that's very important. So any minor change being made has to still, it has to mean that the article still stands. It hasn't changed the conclusions of the article. And we will also issue it where there are no questions of integrity. So correction notice can be used where there's no overall concerns, like there's no misconduct there either. So I'll show you an example. So this was an example where the authors had to correct table 1 because there was a slight error in how they had labeled things. And so what you would see in the correction notice is that you would see that there's this notice saying this article, which is the one, the title there, has been corrected. It will give you details. What is the article title? Who are the authors? What is the journal? What what is its citation details? And then there's a brief explanation. There was an error in table 1. They explain what the error was. They provided the correct version of table 1. And what this means that as readers of the content, if you saw the original article before the correction, you would know why you have a different record of that article, because now the article has changed. And because it has changed, we have to be transparent. And this correction notice makes it transparent. Then we have retraction. So retraction is when there is a serious breach of publication ethics, usually. So this can be things like a duplicate publication, serious plagiarism, or there could be other research integrity issues, for example, unethical research, data falsification, etc. These are all grounds for retraction. Sometimes, though, it's honest error. It's the authors themselves have noticed a problem. So the authors themselves say, actually, there is a problem with our data. We need to retract the article. And that's very good scholarly behavior. So when that happens, we would always say that in the retraction notice, that the authors are retracting. And the key is to note the retraction is not to name or shame or blame anyone. It's only to correct the scholarly record. It's for us to say this article is no longer valid. Here's an example. So what you will see is that the retracted article, the notice is linked to the original article. It tells you who is retracting. In our case, in this one, it's the editors and the publisher. We give the article detail, and then we say, why are we retracting? So we explain there are problems with the integrity of the data, and actually the authors confirmed this, that there are fundamental problems. So they're agreeing to retract the article, and the article does not disappear. It remains online with a retracted watermark and attached to this notice. So that's what I mean by the article will not disappear. In this example, it was actually the authors who noticed the problem. So I just wanted to show you a different way we can retract. Here we say the editor, authors, and publisher are retracting. And then we say why. So this is that the authors noticed a coding error in their data. And then they came to the editor and publisher, and we are confirming there are no other concerns. And so this was retracted. So authors can also say, I want to retract the article for these reasons. The other thing we have is an expression of concern. And this is where the investigation is running for a long time, and it's of a serious nature, but it's not concluded yet. However, we think that the nature of the work that this paper represents could pose harm if we don't note our concern. Because the idea is to say to readers that there may be a concern on this article. Why? Because our readers are mainly researchers or policymakers, so they're relying on our work for their own work. So we need to be transparent. We have to be very careful when we issue an expression of concern, because these are permanent notices. So we only do it when we think it's absolutely necessary. And the authors will always be part of that discussion. So we will always inform them that we have to do an expression of concern. It's not an automatic thing we do. It would be done after very, very careful consideration. Here is an example. So here we see who is issuing the expression of concern. It's the publisher and editor. And then we give the reason. There's a problem about the integrity of the article content. We've reached out to the authors. We've asked them for information, but they're not responding to our queries. And that's why the key is the last line here. Therefore, as we continue to work through the issues raised, we advise readers to interpret the information presented in the article with due caution. And that is the reason that we published the expression of concern. And in very rare circumstances, we might have to remove the content of the article, not the record of the article, but the content. So in specific circumstances, when the article content itself is harmful, then we have to remove that, but keep a removal notice on the record of the article. So we will do this if the content contains some legal problems, like defamation, or has breached some kind of legal requirement. It could be the content cannot be shared because it's sensitive, it's subject to a court order. It could be the content actually poses a high risk of harm to a population or to a person, or it could be breach of privacy. So one of the common things we see is we have published like maybe a case history of a person, and the author didn't get consent to publish from that person, but they have published their whole case history and they recognize themselves and they never gave consent. So then they would come to us and say, this is about me, I never gave consent, this breaches my privacy. So in that case, we have to remove the content and replace it with a notice. So I'm showing you here an example of a notice. This article, the content was removed. If you had the details of the article, you would still find a record of it, But what you would find is this notice saying the editors and publishers are withdrawing the above article for legal reasons. So that's an example of the kind of things we do. So just to summarize here, correction notices are for minor issues. So when errors or issues do not impact the integrity of the article. Retraction notices are for serious issues. So this is where they can arise from duplicate publications, from plagiarism, or research integrity issues. And removal is for the most critical of situations. It's very rare, and we would only do it when it's absolutely necessary because of legal reasons, privacy breaches, or to prevent potential harm. This is rare, but we have to do it to protect everyone. So that brings us to the summary section. So the summary section is designed just to give you a little bit of tips on how to avoid problems. But before we do that, I just wanted to talk briefly about who is responsible for publishing ethics, because we're here today, there's Victoria and I, from the publisher side, and there's all of you from the researcher side, author side, institution side. It's because we're all responsible. So authors are responsible for the integrity of their work. Institutions are responsible because the research happens under them, as well as societies. Editors are responsible because they're the gatekeepers. They are publishing the work. Reviewers are responsible because they are asked to comment on the quality of the work. And publishers are responsible because we take the work and we send it out into the world. So we all are collectively responsible, and we all need to work together to protect the integrity of what is published. So just before we finish, and there will also be a quiz towards the end, some quick tips for you. The first is authorship. Agree on authorship early on. Ensure that anyone who meets authorship criteria has been included. And be aware of the role and responsibility of the corresponding author. So all those things like ensuring co-authors agree on the journal, ensuring they agree on changes to the manuscript, ensuring that all relevant declarations on funding and competing interests have been declared. Number 2 is storing original data securely. While you're doing your research, have a data management plan. Ensure all original data, including images, are clearly labeled and stored, because you may be asked to share this. Some journals make it mandatory to share it, but even journals that don't make it mandatory may ask you for these files, and this can happen even after publication. And if the data set you have includes information, detailed information on humans, then always ensure anonymity of that. Anonymity always comes first. The other thing to remember is while you're selecting your journal and before you submit, check the mandatory requirements of the journal, because different journals will have different types of requirements. All of the journals will ask you to confirm originality, but if your work is a clinical trial, it will be expected that it has been registered in a suitable database. The journal could have a mandatory data sharing policy, so you have to think, okay, can you share your data? If you can't, then maybe look for another journal. If you can, then prepare the files for submission. And then look for any other kind of mandatory deposition policies relevant to the discipline or field based on established community norms. If anything is mandatory in the journal, then they will state it on the homepage. So if you are aware of it early on, it will prevent problems for you later on. Number 4 is declarations on ethical conduct. So when making declarations about the ethical conduct of your study, you may include a statement on ethical approval of the study from the appropriate ethics or institution board. If your work includes animals or stem cells or technologies which can impact privacy, we would expect a statement on ethics from there. If there are dual use research of concern, there would be considerations for that. If there are participants, then we would always declare informed consent. And if anyone can be potentially identified, then consent for publication should be declared. And then we have citing relevant sources and previous versions. So be quite mindful of your reference list, making sure that you are citing appropriate, balanced, and relevant sources, things that are evidence-based. And if any previous full versions exist online, we talked about translations, we talked about preprints, do ensure these have been cited. And ensure permissions have been obtained from the copyright or license holder or owner of any images or models. And follow ethical guidance for reuse of any content, including from social media. So those are the tips I will end that session with. We will have a short quiz now, but I will stop for questions again if anyone has questions. So I don't see any questions. So what I might do is we can start with the quiz. And for your answers for the quiz, if you like, it would be great if you could type what you think the answer should be in the chat box. So hopefully we'll have some fun. Let's start. So the first one is about plagiarism. So several months after an article was published, so that's paper one, a reader contacted the editor to raise concerns about plagiarized text from their own published paper, paper two. Paper two was published 2 months before paper one. The editor determined large sections of plagiarized text from several sources was present in the introduction, results, and discussion sections. These sections had been added after peer review in response to reviewer comments. The editor asked for an explanation from the authors, and they admitted to plagiarizing the text, but insisted they had intended to revise those sections prior to submitting to the journal. So my question is, what should the editor do? Should the editor retract the article, ask the authors to remove the plagiarized text and issue a correction, or do nothing because the article has already been published? So I'll just wait a few moments so people can answer or think about it. Yeah, we've got some answers. Thank you. Yeah, so thanks for those who answered. So the answer is, and hopefully you won't be surprised, is retract the article. And that's because it's plagiarized from someone else's work, and the authors have also admitted it. So it's a clear case of plagiarism. We couldn't issue a correction because plagiarism is misconduct, and we would not do nothing because we have a responsibility towards content that we have published. Great, thank you. Next one. Ghost authorship is a major concern because it's scary. It hides contributors of the work by not listing them as authors. It enables non-contributors of the work to be listed as an author. So just take a moment and think, why is ghost authorship a major concern? Yep, we got quite a few people answering. Excellent, thank you. Yes, and the answer is because it hides contributors of the work by not listing them as authors. So ghost authorship is where someone has not been added and they should have been. Number 3 would be enabling non-contributors of the work. That's gift authorship. So the answer here is 2. Thank you. Next one. Competing interests that are not financial don't need to be declared. True or false? Oh, it's great. People are being really fast. Excellent. Yeah. So the answer is false. So any competing interests have to be declared, whether or not it's financial or non-financial. So now, obtaining ethical approval is not required for any research studies where participants can't be identified. So keep in mind, this is about ethical approval. Is that true or false? Great, a lot of answers. Thank you. Yeah, and the answer is false. So this is because ethical approval, we would always expect to see, well, most of the times, ethical approval, and it's not about whether or not the participants can be identified or not. If participants can be identified, we talk about consent to publish. But otherwise, ethical approval, we would expect it to be required for most types of research studies. And now this is the final quiz. You want to submit a translated version of your publication. What steps should you take? Check with the original publisher if there are any restrictions or permission requirements. Make a query to the editor about if they consider translated articles. Provide a statement in the article to make clear it is a translated version. Name the translator and cite the source. Or number 4, all of these. Yeah, excellent. Got a lot of answers there. And you're right, it's all of these. So if you have a translated version of your publication, it's all of these steps that you need to think about in order to submit that and publish it. So that is great. That brings us to the end of this session. I'm happy to answer any further questions. But thank you so much for your attention and your time. So I don't see any new questions coming through, but I'm happy to wait a bit more. But Thank you all very much for your comments as well in the chat box. I appreciate that. Oh, I love all those little reactions.
So if there are no more questions, on behalf of the University of Social Science and Humanity, I would like to say thank you, Dr. Victoria, Dr. Sabina, and Li Pui from Thailand, Francis, to effort collaboration with us in this series of training course. And we also very appreciate the collaboration from the University of Nguyễn Tất Thành and other university as well. Especially, I would like to say thank you, Mr. Trí Nguyễn from iGroup. He is one very important among us in this seminar. And finally, last but not least, I would like to say thank you on participation from the university around Vietnam and other people who spent last 2 days with us. We hope that you will very success in the future in publishing. Thank you.
Yeah. Cảm ơn tất cả các quý thầy cô đã nhiệt tình tham dự 2 khóa tập huấn từ nghiên cứu đến công bố quốc tế ngày hôm nay. Và một lần nữa thì ban tổ chức có một cái lưu ý muốn nhắc với thầy cô là những thầy cô nào mà đăng nhập link trên link của người khác ấy, thì vui lòng gửi lại thông tin chính xác lại cho ban tổ chức qua email thư viện a.hcmush.edu.vn để cho nhà xuất bản có thể gửi cái giấy chứng nhận cho các thầy cô một cách chính xác. Tại hiện nay thì trên cái phần mà participant đó thì thấy là có những cái link bị trùng lặp, có thể là do các thầy cô sử dụng link của nhau ấy, cho nên là số lượng cái tài khoản nó bị giống nhau rất là nhiều. Vì vậy ban tổ chức cũng như nhà xuất bản sẽ không biết chính xác thầy cô nào đã đăng nhập. Tại nguyên tắc là các thầy cô sẽ phải nhập theo email của chính mình. Vì vậy một lần nữa ban tổ chức xin thông báo là nếu các thầy cô muốn nhận được cái giấy chứng nhận từ nhà xuất bản Thailand Francis cấp thì phải gửi lại thông tin chính xác của chính các thầy cô cho ban tổ chức qua email thư viện a.hcmush.edu.vn để ban tổ chức có thể gửi cho nhà xuất bản một cách chính xác. Một lần nữa thay mặt ban tổ chức rất cảm ơn tất cả quý thầy cô, các nhà nghiên cứu, các anh chị em, các anh chị học viên sau đại học đã nhiệt tình tham gia 2 khóa tập huấn nền tảng xuất bản và đạo đức nghiên cứu của trường Đại học Khoa học Xã hội Nhân văn phối hợp với Đại học Nguyễn Tất Thành tổ chức lần này. Và rất hy vọng trong những lần tập huấn tiếp theo sẽ được tiếp tục đồng hành cùng với các thầy cô để hỗ trợ các thầy cô có thể có nhiều cái công bố quốc tế hơn nữa trong tương lai. Xin cảm ơn và xin hẹn gặp lại quý thầy cô. Xin mời các thầy cô ở trong ban tổ chức có thể bật cam để chụp hình ạ. I would like to invite Miss Sabina Alam, Miss Victoria, open your camera and take a photo with us.
Yeah, my camera is on.
Yes. Sorry. Miss Victoria, yeah.
Yeah.
Chị Thuận Anh ơi.
Phải rồi.
Okay.
That's how you say.
Vâng ơi, chuẩn bị Vâng. Vâng đâu rồi? Okay. 1, 2, 3, smile. Finish.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you everyone. Bye
Thank
bye.
you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Xin lỗi mọi người, xin còn một câu nữa là nhà xuất bản có thể sẽ gửi cái bản khảo sát cho các thầy cô ấy ạ. Các thầy cô vui lòng điền cái bản khảo sát giúp cho nhà xuất bản và cũng như cho ban tổ chức để có thể lần sau tổ chức cái khóa tập huấn nó được tốt hơn ạ. We welcome your feedback out from that will be sent to you after this session.
Oh,
Yeah.
great. Yeah, I'm putting together just a short little feedback document for you so we can just, you know, we're always trying to improve. So I'll send you that, but any feedback you have for us would be very much appreciated.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Great. All right. Thanks so much. Hopefully we'll speak soon.
See you.
It's been great
Bye.
working
Thank
with
you,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. All right.